all hyped up about the sea levels rising 3 to 7 feet by the end of the century. I understand if that happens, the San Francisco airport would be underwater. So is this all an exaggeration?
Well, I would say that one of the most clear representations of what's to come are the pictures of glaciers. You can see pictures from not only 50 years ago that show significant change that has occurred within our lifetime. That suggests that we must prepare.
Ah, so do we have rowboats beside our houses?
Certainly, what climate scientists are telling us is that based on tidal gauges and satellites are showing us that over the past century, sea level has already risen by 8 inches, or has risen and is has increased more rapidly in the last 20 years. And even we have tidal gauges on the Golden Gate Bridge that tell us that over the past century that sea level has risen by about 8 inches as well.
So it seems like we're going to be in difficult waters, huh? I understand because of this warming that storms are going to be more violent, they're going to last longer, and the weather conditions are going to be more severe.
Yeah, and one of the concerns that is prevalent in areas that have lots of rain are it's hard to predict how the creeks, the streams, how they are going to be able to handle the excess capacity. The city of East Palo Alto, for example, in 2012 had to declare an emergency because one of the creeks that runs through the city, the San Francisco Creek, overtopped its banks, started flooding neighborhoods in the city. This type of incident is going to become more prevalent if, in fact, the models that are predicting what's to come are accurate.
Well, you know, I remember a few years ago, the city of East Palo Alto during El Nino, and I don't remember the exact year El Nino occurred during the 1990s.
1998.
98. I can remember people in rowboats
Mm-hmm.
in Palo Alto, along Embarcadero and some of the streets along there. So you're saying it's going to be more like that. What you wrote about the city of Alameda, and so tell us something about your findings.
I wrote about the city of Alameda, and they have a master infrastructure plan for an area that they're planning to develop, which is Alameda Point, and it's the former Naval Air Station. And so in that plan, their plan includes mitigation strategies for sea level rise. And it's unique, though, because most of that area, or a lot of that area, they can rebuild because it's all old infrastructure. And so they kind of have that flexibility to sort of have a blank slate and put in those measures versus, like, you know, having to do that put in protections for existing infrastructure.
Okay, we'll talk more about some of those protections. A recent article, and I know I read one that I would like for us to see if we could bring it up, that the severe flooding that we're talking about will affect areas on the peninsula, for instance, where low-income people live.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular article that we can see now, if we can just kind of scroll through the article, it was up on the screen briefly. Cities like East Palo Alto, cities like Oakland along the edges, cities like Alameda too. So if we could just scroll down through some of that article, if it can be full screen, and we can just kind of slowly see some of the visuals in the article, if you could show the visual in the article that talks about the level of sea rise. And that was the first thing that actually struck me, the idea that the flooding, the areas in the Bay Area, for instance, we've seen enough of the article, thank you, it will affect minority communities the most. Why is that the case?
Well, I think historically, if you are low income, you are going to navigate to those areas that have the lowest cost land. Historically, some of the most polluting industries, the ports, are located in those areas. It's not desirable for many households. As a result of that, the land prices are lower, the rents are lower. So people that are low income naturally navigate to those areas. So the concern is, well, if sea level rise is going to have a disproportionate impact on people that are low income, what can we collectively do to mitigate that? It's a concern that will be intergenerational because, as you indicated earlier, the rise in sea levels is increasing. 3 to 7 feet by 2100 means that, well, what do we do for those large populations that are at risk?
Now, Laura was just saying the city of Alameda has a plan. When you wrote your article, we're talking about low-income communities. Would Alameda, where you did your investigation, would it rank in that category?
There are certainly areas within Alameda that fall under the social vulnerability index, which is part of what the report that you had featured on the screen was talking about, in which we have this a project between New American Media and Climate Central, mapping areas based on income level, age, and other factors, including renters and versus homeowners, and there's all these factors that sort of, I guess, increase your risk level or your social vulnerability level. And so, so in Alameda, for example, one thing I did find is that there is according to the census, the last census, there is a high rate of people living in senior living centers or senior living housing and nursing facilities, and so that in itself is a risk factor. What we saw with Katrina, as an example, I think as a risk factor are people who don't have access to transportation, be able to cars, and so if you're immobile and you can't get out in time, it also raises questions about our emergency preparedness and how able.
So we're talking about maybe during a storm, because if sea level is going to rise that much by 2100, we have plenty of time, right? But we're talking about specific floods and storms that might be coming that will be more severe. So as we talk, were you going to say something?
Right. I would point out that just like in any event that there's a major calamity, there are overlapping risks or hazards that occur simultaneously. For example, our city would be most susceptible to winds coming out of the west, out of the east. So that there's something that we call wave run-up. And if we have winds accompanied by storms and a high tide, that's what would be a perfect storm. And in that event, it could occur quickly. And for that reason, a lot of the emergency preparedness activities are geared toward preparing the community for that eventuality. For example, safe shelter, critically important. If you go to Katrina, areas that have been inundated in the past, if you had a second story, you have a place for shelter. In the they have required access to the roof.
The only thing about it is one doesn't know how high the waters are going to come up. Now, if you have a second story, you might be safe, but that depends on how high the water comes.
Well, there is what FEMA has provided as guidance. We call them elevation certificates. You, as a homeowner, if you're in the flood zone, you're required to identify if you're doing what they call substantial improvement, more than a 50% increase in the property value is being upgraded, then you are required to elevate the structure. That's a trigger, 50%, so that it is at least the bottom of the lowest floor is at least the level
How can you, if, for example, you're on a concrete slab,
concrete slab.
as some houses are, many are in Palo Alto, for instance, East Palo Alto maybe. How do you elevate? Are you expected to elevate those buildings?
That's a very good point. Eichlers, for example,
Yes.
historic structures
Yes.
typically built on slab on grade. Those are probably the most difficult structures to retrofit in the event of an inundation. In that event, the only option that I could see would be the requirement or potential opportunity to establish a second floor.
The only thing about it with Eichlers, because they're historic buildings, people don't want to. They think having a second floor destroys the look of the house itself, and many people have written petitions so that you can't build a second story. So maybe that's something that will change.
I would say that one has to look at it in the form of a toolbox, that you might have 7 different types of wrenches. One wrench might be to strengthen the levees. Another wrench might say, well, in this area we don't have Eichlers. A second story safe shelter might be advisable.
Okay, so let's keep the toolbox idea in mind, and we'll come back to talk about some more tools. In the meantime, Laura, I'd like to pull up your article, because I guess you could talk about some of the plans that Alameda has come up with, would be like tools in the toolbox? Okay. Can we see the second link, which would be your article? Does it look familiar?
That one, is that it, I think?
Well, your article.
Oh, there's mine, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So talk about your article.
Oh, wait, that's not it.
It's the one that the title is How One City Plans to...
Oh, yeah. How an island city plans to hold back rising tides.
How an island city plans to hold back rising tides. Is that the one we're looking at?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I focused on Alameda Island, and
is it surrounded on 3 sides?
Also, the whole island is surrounded by water.
Oh, okay.
And so Alameda Point has a plan, a master infrastructure plan, part of their big development project to redevelop the area, and within that they do have a plan for sea level rise, because much of that area is expected to be inundated by water, and so they have plans in mitigation strategies, which include raising the level of the land, and that's through fill, and so. Currently, they have a plan of raising that to about 2 feet.
The land that has buildings on it?
So that's why they're sort of in this unique kind of place, because it's a former naval air station that the city now has and that they can redevelop, and most of it they basically can tear down the old infrastructure and start new. So this is very unique. You can't do this. They can't do this in the other parts of the island, and so they can tear down the existing infrastructure and raise the level so that it's right now the plan is to raise it by 2 feet, and then also incorporate other strategies which you mentioned, which was like they have a plan for a levee, but that's sort of in the future as money kind of goes into it.
It doesn't sound like it's an area right now that's thickly populated.
No,
okay.
There's some housing out there. There is supportive housing out there for individuals who have maybe no or low income that are in formal Navy housing.
Any plans for those in more populated areas?
So that's what my report is about as well, is that there really isn't much of a plan in terms of the other areas of the island that are expected to be inundated as well. So, the South Shore and the other parts of the island. And so what has happened, though, on the South Shore is that, according to a professor I talked to, Professor Christina Hill at UC Berkeley, who's in the environmental design department, she basically talked about how on the South Shore of Alameda Island, there has been a lot of erosion, and the waves have sort of pushed the sand out, which has created a way of sort of reducing the momentum of the waves. So inadvertently, they've sort of done that, and then they've recently have also dumped more sand because of the erosion that has been happening on that part of the island.
Well, it seems like the city officials in Alameda is doing something, at least for some parts of the island. Tools in the toolbox. We talked about two of them.
Another one is recognizing that certain areas need to have better access. So the city of East Palo Alto identified 5 local priorities. One is developing access to those areas of the city that are flooded. So we have requested or planned to build a pedestrian overcrossing, recognizing that some of the byways used by cars may not be an option for the residents that need to leave. The other option is shelter in place, and that's just staying at home. You have a safe place there, a second story that can accommodate you and the family, so you don't leave your home. The other option, the third option that we talked about, was levees. And then there are other options that I think are equally important, and that was mentioned before, that the elevation of the homes. Historic structures, Eichlers, may not qualify for that. People want to retain that historic aspect. But there are many other homes that have been constructed in the floodplain, or the regulatory floodplain, that can be raised, that aren't slab on grade. And
well, it seems to me when we're talking about the sea level rising, just raising your house might not be enough, because you're also going to have to, I mean, if this
it's not enough, you're right.
If this is going to be a permanent situation, then the sea level, the level itself, is going to be higher. And we're not just talking about during a time of flooding. We're talking about the water actually being higher. Mm-hmm. So you can raise your house, or you can have a second story, but what about the streets?
Right. And if you look around, some communities, I think of one, Richmond, British Columbia, where a lot of the city of Richmond, which is just south of Vancouver, is in the regulatory floodplain, and all of the roads are elevated, and the roads are actual levees themselves. Mm-hmm. So there is perpetual access to those communities because they use the roads.
Did this just come about? It seems to me you don't just raise a road just like that. It takes tremendous planning.
Yes, I believe that their planning envisioned that they would have a series of roads, that if the water were to make it past one, there would be another obstacle for the water to pass. Insofar as the city of East Palo Alto is concerned, we have to be cognizant that our problem, the city of East Palo Alto's problem, is shared by the adjacent municipalities. And it's significant to note that these adjacent municipalities have some of the highest realty in the country. So in some instances, fortification makes sense because the values that are protected are so high. In other locations, FEMA's guidance is to acquire those properties, to remove homes from the floodplain. That is another tool in the toolbox.
Well, if it seems like we're going to have a whole lot of tools in the toolbox if the actual sea level is going to be completely rising. And at the same time, when we talk about tools in the toolbox, what about the financial ability of the cities to actually make those changes?
Well, I think that's the challenge that many cities are facing. You know, I think, at least from what I could tell, it's like the conversation is certainly happening at the regional level. You know, MTC is
Metropolitan Transit Commission.
yeah,
Transportation.
you know, and it's because a lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our roadways and airports are in areas that are going to be completely flooded and inundated. And, you know, MTC is working with the BCDC, which is the Bay Area
Conservation
Development. And
As a city planner, you would know all of that.
and you know, so there are conversations happening on the regional level about what needs to happen, but then you know, then it comes down to the cost, and these are really expensive things. Levees are really, really expensive.
Very expensive.
And for Alameda Point, their estimate is for their sea rise mitigation and flood, you know. Flood protection strategy is about $109 million. That's just a cost estimate for that one area. And so, you know,
It's like, where is all of this money coming from?
right, when you already have cities struggling to pay for existing issues, you know, protecting basic services, that becomes a challenge for many cities.
Yes, I would think so. Now, I have heard that if we stop driving, if we all stop driving right now, we still would have a problem. We can't turn back the clock. The glaciers would continue to melt.
That's so true. You remind me of one of the professors, the head of the Marine Center in the University of Washington, who indicated that right now what's dissolved in the ocean might have been generated in the Industrial Revolution, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in the 1890s. So it might take 100 years for the carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere for the concentrations to reach such a level that it starts dissolving in the oceans. And when it dissolves, I imagine many of you may have traveled to Mexico and seen the second largest reef in the world near Cancun. The corals will be at risk. The biodiversity of the planet is at stake. So what do we do to prevent that is a question.
And can we prevent it? Can we prevent it, given the circumstances where we are now? How do we prevent what's going on?
I don't know if I have the answer to that, but
I understand you can't fight Mother Nature.
Right, but there is always a belief that technology might find sequestering of carbon. There has been a lot of research, and some of it is highly theoretical.
Well, taking carbon out of the air?
Taking carbon out of the air. And so, will that ever materialize in our lifetime? Maybe not.
Oh, that's interesting. You were going to say?
Oh, I don't know if I have the answer to, you know, whether we are going to stop sea rise from happening. But I think that there are certainly strategies around that are being put forward around adapting to the rising seas. And while, you know,
we'll grow fins. Adaptation will go back to the sea somehow.
Or
the
Venice.
Sea, yes, the sea is coming to us.
Well, there are cities that have, I mean, you know, Holland is a really great example, who they're surrounded by water, and they've been living like this for many, many, many years, and have, you know, have gone from a you know, framework or strategy of sort of engineering to keep the water back to now sort of maybe moving more in a direction of designing sort of with nature and kind of living with, you know, creating mitigation strategies that are more in tune with nature and creating habitat, you know, replacing that loss of habitat with wetlands and estuaries and, you know, beaches, beach nourishment and other things like that.
More tools in the toolbox,
Well,
other than growing fins.
I think I just heard Laura coin the phrase, design with nature. There's a book by that name.
So did you coin that?
I did not.
And designing with nature, I think from the standpoint of local economics, in some communities might make sense. That if you design your environment so that the floodwaters can find the natural path to the sea, and not allow any obstructions like housing or schools to be in the way. That might reduce the cost of local government.
So, but wait a moment, what does that do to local government? For example, if most of East Palo Alto would be underwater, then do you take away all of the homes? Maybe you move the city. Where do you move the city?
Well,
get rid of the city.
Right, and that's a good question. In the case of East Palo Alto, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, 49% of the city roughly is in the regulatory floodplain, which means that in that 100-year event, it'll likely be inundated, that 49% of the land area. But one of the risks that's prevalent is the fact that we have a dual overlapping concern. One is high tide. Two is heavy precipitation that coincides with the high tide that prevents the water coming down from the mountains to exit into the ocean. So the question is, can you, and this is where a lot of the research has been going, can you find areas that can detain or retain water so that as the ocean recedes, the water can go back out to sea?
No, this is ironic that we're having this whole conversation about sea level rising when California is in the middle of a drought. And it's a bad drought. So how do you convince people, like, hey, we need to worry about the water when they're being told to cut back? Make sure you're not using too much water.
Well, I mean, I think that it's part of it is understanding how, global warming is happening and the contributions to sea level rise, which we talked about a little bit earlier. It's, we're talking about thermal expansion and sort of the rising of temperatures and the rising of temperature of the ocean waters, which causes that to expand as well. And then the melting of polar ice caps and less snowpack, which creates more melting and in the with hotter temperatures and less snow, and so that's more runoff, and then we have Greenland and West Antarctica basically melting, and so that's all contributing to more water, rising sea levels.
And I think perhaps the disappearance of our forests, like the Amazon, for instance, where there would be, and our wetlands, where there would be areas that would absorb the moisture.
Mm-hmm.
That has the making of a perfect storm.
Yes, it is.
And one of the components of the storm is the fact that as the ice and the snow melt, the surface of the earth gets darker. And as you know, if you ever want to generate energy, we have these new types of devices that they like it when it's dark, because the sun rays can actually be captured, and you capture that energy as opposed to reflecting it, which the snow does. So as Antarctica and Greenland have less and less white snow, it'll reflect the sun's rays less and less and absorb more and more, thereby accelerating the increase of the Earth's temperature, the heat island effect. But now...
That doesn't mean volcanoes.
It doesn't mean volcanoes.
It doesn't mean earthquakes. No.
No, it means that over time, the impact of the sun on the Earth, with the loss of the forests, the loss of the snow that reflects the sun, it may have a sort of an effect that is accelerating. And so this is the
accelerating the problem.
Accelerating the speed with which climate change occurs.